I want you to picture an Airbus A380 for a moment. Awesome, right? Now, the A380's seat capacity varies quite a bit between airlines, but let's say it carries around 525 passengers. If you add another 20 cabin crew plus 4 pilots for a long-haul flight, then you're looking at around 550 people in total. Now, think about how many lithium batteries these people could potentially be carrying. Pretty much everyone has an iPhone or a phone of some sort, but then we have tablets, laptops, cameras, e-book readers, gaming consoles, smartwatches, Bluetooth headphones, vapes, flashlights, spare battery packs, and nearly all of them are powered by lithium batteries. When I fly as a passenger myself, I know that I alone could be carrying at least 3 or 4 battery-powered devices, so that means that a fully loaded Airbus A380 with 550 people could easily be carrying over 2,000 lithium batteries. And even on a 180-seat 737 or Airbus A320, there could be over 700 of them. And the thing is, lithium batteries are actually classified as dangerous goods, which can pose a very real, serious risk to safety if they're not handled correctly. So, how dangerous are they, and what should you do about them? Stay tuned. Lithium batteries are actually quite remarkable devices. In fact, they're considered one of the most impactful inventions of our time, so impressive that they won their founding father, Sir Michael Stanley Whittington, a Nobel Prize in Chemistry, and rightfully so. These batteries have really revolutionized quite a few industries, but probably the most noticeable is portable electronics, where these batteries today power basically everything. And you know what Spider-Man says? With great power comes great responsibility. And in this case, risk. You see, these batteries are incredibly useful, but that energy that they hold also makes them a serious hazard if they are, for example, badly made, improperly stored or packaged, if they're damaged or incorrectly charged. In the wrong conditions, they can catch fire and actually even explode, which is obviously not something that we want on an aircraft. How dangerous are they exactly? Well, between 1991 and 2016, the FAA has recorded 171 incidents involving lithium batteries on both passenger and cargo aircraft. And while that might not sound like much given the numbers that I mentioned earlier, what's really concerning is the speed with which a fire involving these batteries can get out of control. That speed comes from the fact that, like I mentioned, these battery packs keep a lot of energy inside of them, which is stored inside some pretty flammable materials. When these materials start heating up, if the energy can't disperse fast enough, well then it can rapidly enter into something that we call a thermal runaway. And this causes the battery to ignite, releasing flammable and pretty noxious toxic vapors. And when lithium-ion batteries burn, well, they do so at very high temperatures, between 700 and 1000 degrees Celsius. And just to put that into perspective, aircraft seat frames are typically made out of aluminium, which melts at around 660 degrees Celsius, so that's not good. On top of all of this, the batteries also create all of the conditions that they need to burn themselves, which makes them notoriously hard to extinguish. But you will be pleased to hear that today's cabin crew have very specific procedures for dealing with this. If a device is starting to let out smoke but is not yet on fire, the cabin crew will place it into a fire-resistant pouch or metal box which all aircraft must carry, and they will then use whatever non-flammable liquids that they have in order to try to cool it down. Now, if the device is actually on fire, well, then the crew will don something known as a PBE, that's protective breathing equipment to shield against the fumes, and then using protective gloves to avoid burns, they will unplug the device if it's connected and then douse it in halon. Now, halon is pretty special. It's the main fire extinguishing agent that we carry on board because it works on all different types of fires. And not just in the cabin, it's also used in the fire suppression systems for the engines and even inside of the cargo bays. Now, what makes halon so useful is that it boils at minus 68 degrees Celsius, so it's still a gas even at high altitude out inside of the engine cells, where most substances at that temperature would be liquids or solids. Plus, you can also super pressure halon, meaning that it can be distributed really quickly even through long, complicated pipe systems. And best of all, it's incredibly effective at smothering fires. You don't need a lot of volume of it. Something like 3% will effectively remove the oxygen and smother the fire, while for example CO2 fire extinguishers need around 21%, which means bigger canisters and much more spraying. But halon also has some serious downsides. It isn't very nice stuff for people to breathe. It's actually quite toxic, and its ability to remove oxygen obviously affects people as well as fires. And on top of that, rather worryingly at this stage, we're actually running out of it. Sources estimate that sometime between 2034 and 2045 there will be none left, and I'll come back to that later on. But if we get back to that phone fire that has now been smoldering away while I've been explaining this, once the flames are hopefully out, the crew will then immerse the burn device in water to cool it down and prevent reignition. And they will then put it into a metal canister filled with water, place it somewhere safe, often a toilet, and then continue keeping an eye on it until that we can get the aircraft down safely on the ground. And no, you're probably not going to get that foam back. Well, if it's not too badly cooked, I guess you could, but I wouldn't count on it. Now, a smoldering passenger phone that can be easily found and removed is one thing, but imagine if that device is in the cockpit instead, surrounded by other electrical equipment. Or if the device is under a motorized business class seat where it has been crushed. Accessing it to prevent a fire from spreading can then be incredibly difficult. So here comes an important safety tip. If you're ever traveling in such a seat and drop your phone under it, do not try to move the seat. Cabin crew have specific training to access these areas, but running the chairs back and forth trying to retrieve your phone is likely to damage the battery, and that is what could lead to a fire. Now, if we would have a device fire in the cockpit, we also have special procedures for that, which normally includes getting it out of the cockpit as quickly as possible to leave it with the cabin crew so that they can do their drills. But everything that is battery powered inside of the cockpit needs to be well controlled, approved and within reach. Now, even if you're not traveling in a business class seat, there are a few really important safety tips that you need to keep in mind, and probably one of the most important ones of those is do not put lithium power devices in your checked-in luggage. Now, I'll show you why that's so important in a minute, but while we're on the subject of dangerous things, did you know that your personal data is probably right now being bought and sold out on the web to everything from scammers and cyber criminals to banks and insurance companies? Well, I can almost guarantee you that it is, and that's where today's sponsor, Delete Me, comes in. A few months ago, Dominic, my lead editor over on Mentour Pilot, started noticing that he was getting more and more spam and robocalls. And after a very short investigation, it turned out that loads of his personal info, everything from his home address to social media profiles, email addresses, and even details about his relatives, was being offered up on dozens of different data broker sites. Now, luckily, we were in contact with Delete Me, so he signed up and they immediately started doing what they do best, wiping his private data away from these sites, without him having to do anything himself.
Wow.
With the help of Delete Me, you can take the first steps towards taking back control of your privacy, and they will then just keep working for you, tirelessly, for as long as you stay with them. Dominic started seeing results almost immediately, and he can now follow Delete Me's progress as more and more brokers are being told to remove his data. And that, of course, allows him to continue working hard for me instead, which just makes me happy. So if that's something that you're interested in trying, get 20% off Delete Me's US consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/mentornow and use the promo code mentornow. That's joindeleteme.com/mentornow with code mentornow. Thank you, Delete Me. Now back to the video. So lithium batteries in the cargo hold can be a huge threat. If an aircraft is carrying known dangerous goods, well, then the crew will receive what we call a NOTOC, which stands for Notice to the Captain. Dangerous goods are always packaged and handled in very specific ways, and only controlled quantities are allowed on passenger aircraft. But of course, if people are packing their own dangerous goods, there's no way for the airline to control this, and the risk of a fire down in the hold goes up quite a bit. On top of that, we also have to deal with things like nuisance warnings. Remember that I mentioned that we were running short of halon? Well, the FAA estimates that the annual usage from false alarms alone is between 13,000 and 17,000 pounds of halon, which suggests around 300 plus false alarms in a year. Now, when it comes to fires, we have a saying: if there is any doubt, well, then there is no doubt. If the crew gets a cargo fire warning, they are going to take it very seriously, and it could become a very tough situation to deal with. Just imagine that this is happening over a remote region with few, if any, really safe options for landings. It's something that a lot of us pilots are continuously thinking about, particularly when we're flying out over vast oceans. And what if that warning that we're receiving is intermittent? Could it be spurious or false? Well, like I said, if we can't tell, well, then we have to assume that it's real and think about the worst case scenario. And that worst case scenario could definitely be a lithium battery fire spreading rapidly inside of our hold. The most extreme and disturbing examples of this actually happening involve cargo aircraft. In September of 2010, a UPS Boeing 747 crashed close to Dubai International Airport after a fire had broken out in their cargo hold. Now, I covered this accident over on the Mentour Pilot channel, which you should definitely check out, but what I want to highlight here is just how quickly it all happened. The first indication the UPS crew got was a fire main deck forward message at time 1915. At this point, they were just 120 nautical miles northwest of Dubai, where they had departed from, and within minutes, the cockpit filled with smoke, obscuring the instruments to the point where the crew couldn't even see enough to change radio frequencies, let alone try to fly the aircraft. And on top of that, the captain was soon forced to disconnect the autopilot in order to hand fly it, but when he disconnected, he discovered that they had lost elevator control. The fire had burned through the protective fire-resistant lining in the hold and was now also burning through the flight control system. It soon also affected the emergency oxygen system, so at around time 1920, just 5 minutes after the first warning, the captain went unconscious, leaving the first officer to battle the situation alone. And tragically, another 25 minutes later, flying literally blind in a smoke-filled cockpit, he ultimately lost control of the aircraft and it crashed in the outskirts of Dubai. Now, it later turned out that the aircraft had been carrying more than 81,000 lithium batteries, which the pilots didn't even know about. Like I said, this was an extreme example and several factors had led up to it, but a year later a second crash happened, also involving a 747 freighter. And sure enough, this aircraft was also carrying lithium batteries, along with some other seriously risky materials like paint and resin. Now, before you start worrying about all of this too much, freighter aircraft can have cargo compartments of different types with different fire suppression requirements. And they are allowed to carry a lot more dangerous goods than passenger aircraft can, and that's partly thanks to those additional requirements. But there's another big difference here. They don't carry you. The rules regarding what can and cannot be carried inside of the cargo bays themselves are, like I mentioned before, different and stricter for passenger aircraft. First of all, the cargo compartments are lined with panels tested for 927 degrees Celsius up to 5 minutes. That's 1700 Fahrenheit. They also must be able to fill with smoke so bad that you can't see your hand 18 inches or 46 centimeters in front of you and still remain smoke tight, so nothing can waft up into the passenger cabin or cockpit. You see, the firefighting system in these aircraft works by first releasing the suppression agent straight into the hold to try and smother the fire, and then slowly releasing more of it over a long period of time in order to try to keep that fire suppressed. And that can be as long as 240 minutes in some aircraft. But the aim here is to suppress the fire, not necessarily to extinguish it completely, and the temperature of a suppressed fire could still be well over 200 degrees Celsius. That's why no pilot is going to think about flying for anything like 240 minutes if they can avoid it. As soon as we get that warning, we will start diverting. And like I've mentioned in many of my previous videos, an uncontained fire is probably the worst emergency that I can think of. This is one of the few cases where the QRH, the Quick Reference Handbook, actually tells us to consider an off-field landing if we don't have a good landing airport close by. So, what can you do about all of this? What devices can you take on board and where can you put them? Well, it's all laid out in the IATA Dangerous Goods Guide, and a lot of that is then summarized for you passengers at the airport check-in counters, and sometimes it's even written on the back of your ticket. As a passenger, you are responsible for knowing exactly what and how much you're carrying with you and how much that is actually allowed. And that can be tricky because the rules are sometimes a little bit confusing. So let's break them down now. First, let's look at devices with non-removable lithium batteries. If these batteries contain more than 0.3 grams of lithium metal or exceed 2.7 watt-hours, well, then they are simply forbidden. You can't check them in, you can't carry them with you or beg the operator for permission. They just are not allowed. Now, if those fixed batteries are under the 0.3 gram or 2.7 watt-hour limit, well then you can take the device on board, but only in the cabin. And 2.7 watt-hours is actually a pretty low limit. Think of the batteries in your Bluetooth headphones, for example. Now, what if you're just carrying a spare or loose battery or a device with removable batteries then? Well, in that case, you can bring it on board, but again, only inside of the cabin and only if it meets certain requirements. Specifically, it must have less than 2 grams of lithium or a capacity of less than 100 watt-hours. That's something like a large power bank, for example, and even most drone batteries will be containing less than that, but you have to check them out carefully. You also need to keep in mind that each passenger can only carry 20 batteries according to IATA. And of course, if you are trying to get on board with a whole load of batteries stuffed into your pockets, well then someone is probably going to ask you some pretty harsh questions before they will let you get anywhere close to the airplane. So that covers normal battery packs and devices, but what about mobility aids like wheelchairs? Well, here things are a little bit different, and it mostly comes down to battery types, like whether they're removable or if they are spillable. But batteries for these type of devices have more generous limits, up to 300 watt-hours. So is your head getting filled with numbers yet? Well, the big point to remember here is actually quite simple. You must never try to sneak anything into your checked-in luggage that you shouldn't, and if you aren't sure, well then just leave it at home. It's not worth it. All this information is available online at your airline's website, and the airlines might actually have additional rules on top of this, so always check them out. Your devices or their removable batteries should always have their capacity written on them in watt-hours, so make sure that you know where to find it if someone at the airport will ask for it. Now, some of you might ask, does any of this really matter? Has something ever happened to a passenger device? And well, in 2014, a Fiji Airways 737 had a narrow escape when a passenger had packaged batteries into his checked-in luggage where some of them short-circuited and caught fire. And this passenger was actually a certified drone pilot. Luckily, all of that happened on the ground, where someone spotted the smoke and alerted the captain who was doing his walk-around, and he just then ran up and instructed his first officer to activate their fire suppression system in the hold and then quickly evacuate the aircraft. When they later inspected the passengers' bags, they found 19 intact batteries and a melted lump of another 6 or 8, which, well, they couldn't really tell how many. But imagine if that had happened in flight instead. That could have been truly disastrous. There's also been plenty of other evacuations happening where mobile phones have started to produce smoke inside of the cabin. And like I mentioned earlier, since we are carrying more and more of these things with us, the risk of this happening is constantly increasing. Hence this video before the holiday travel season. But of course, passenger devices aren't the only places on board where we can find lithium batteries. They also form part of the aircraft themselves, especially if you're flying on a Boeing 787, for example. The 787 is unique because it makes more use of electrical systems than other airliners do. Boeing actually removed a lot of hydraulics and pneumatic systems in order to save some weight and then replaced them with electrics instead. And to power all of that, they installed bigger generators as well as 2 lithium-ion batteries. Now, these batteries are today housed in an enclosure made out of stainless steel with vents to allow gases to escape overboard, but this wasn't always the case. Back in 2013, the second year that the 787 was in service, there were actually 2 major incidents and quite a few smaller ones involving these batteries. First up, on January the 7th, a Japan Airlines aircraft parked at Boston's Logan International experienced a battery overheat. The APU auto shut down as it was designed to do, but when an engineer opened up the aft electronic equipment bay, he noticed flames as well as a lot of smoke. What had happened was that a cell in one of the batteries had short-circuited, which had then initiated a thermal runaway. And incredibly, it was soon found out that this wasn't something that Boeing had tested for, at least not under severe conditions. And they hadn't considered a short circuit leading to a potential fire either. And then, on January the 16th, something even more serious happened. The crew of an all-Nippon Airways 787 bound for Tokyo Haneda had to divert to Takamatsu Airport and evacuate after they had gotten an alert about a battery malfunction and also started smelling fumes. Investigators found that one of the batteries had started buckling and was also leaking. This made airlines in Japan voluntarily ground their 787 fleets, and the FAA also grounded US-based 787s on the day of the second incident. And to put that into perspective, this was the first time the FAA had grounded an entire fleet since back in 1979. Solving the actual problem involved several changes, including putting the batteries in that stainless steel fireproof enclosure that I mentioned earlier, and there were other refinements too, like changes to reduce the chances of battery faults, battery insulation, and changes to the electrolyte used in the batteries themselves. All of this obviously also involved a lot of testing, which brought important lessons for the whole aviation industry. Crucially, this was also a real eye-opener to everyone about lithium batteries in general and how difficult it could be to deal with them in different devices, like yours and mine. So to summarize, these are risks that all passengers, and crew by the way, need to be conscious of. Fire represents one of the biggest risks that we know to aircraft, and playing around with rules around lithium batteries is just unnecessary. But let me end this on a little bit more positive note by also looking at how lithium batteries are actually advancing aviation. Take the Solar Impulse 2 for example, which 2016 completed its circumnavigation of the globe without using a single drop of aviation fuel. It was completely solar powered with a 72-meter wingspan, that's actually bigger than a 747, and its wings were covered in cells that collected solar power stored in lithium polymer batteries. I myself have actually also flown in an all-electric aircraft not too long ago, which wasn't just extremely fun. That plane is also already becoming a valuable training tool for flight schools, as I explained in that video. Now, lithium batteries might need a bit more time, if ever, before they can power aircraft with more than half a dozen seats or so, but they're likely here to stay. And while batteries themselves remain a risky thing to have on board, their positive uses in aviation are constantly growing. Now, if you have questions about this, then make sure that you ask them in the comments below. Or, if you want to ask me directly, then join my Patreon crew by going to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. That way, you can join our monthly Zoom hangouts, and you can now also gift a membership to Patreon to someone that you know might like it, and that would be awesome. Now, watch these videos next and have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.